Good evening. I want to begin by offering my gratitude to Dean Valerie Bridgman for her kind invitation to be here, and to the Williams Institute and the Methodist Theological School in Ohio for hosting me so warmly. I've had some very good food and very good drink here, and it's been so lovely. So thank you so much for your hospitality and your warm welcome. The lecture I bring tonight grows out of a concern I carry as a reader of the biblical text and as a witness to the violent afterlives of empire in our world. My focus will be on Lamentations 1. This is a lecture that is part of a broader book project that I'm currently completing. And this is the first chapter of that book project. And I think, Ryan, you had the privilege of hearing the third chapter of that book project last year at SBL. I want to suggest that when we hear Exile in this first acrostic poem, we must resist treating it as a mere theological abstraction or a one-time historical event. Instead, Exile emerges here as a manufactured weapon of empire carried out by human hands and felt in human flesh. What I hope to do this evening is to trace how the poetry of Lamentations remembers that violence, not only in its theological registers, but in its anthropology of empire. I want to give some background information before I proceed directly into Lamentations 1. I'm talking to you about here in this background information, the human mechanics of empire-driven exile. Because much of what we have in Lamentations fits within the broader prophetic discourse about exile. So I'm pulling some ideas about exile from prophetic literature before we dive into Lamentations 1. In prophetic discourse, images of conquered people and imperial praxis register the human mechanics of empire-driven exile. In Western biblical interpretation, however, much of the focus on exile is victim-centric in ways that subsumes the matrix of imperial violence under a dematerializing theology of divine judgment. Such a move underestimates how the prophetic critique also discerns the human collectivity making empire possible, from women of reproductive age to agricultural laborers to weapons makers to soldiers. For instance, in Robert P. Carroll's widely cited essay, Deportation and Diasporic Discourses in the Prophetic Literature, he interprets Judah's exile as, quote, an event of great violence brought about by the aggression of the invading Babylonians, end quote. Though he acknowledges violence and a human invading force, their exile, or what he calls deportation, is reduced to a singular event. Such an interpretation has a dissolving effect on what is presented in prophetic literature as a staple strategy of ancient empires for conquering people. I would even label it a habit of empire. By singularizing exile, Carroll detaches it from the contingent forces of empire that not only made it an event of great violence, but more acutely a crowning strategy within an imperial complex. Such a rendering, in turn, relativizes the violence, reducing it to arbitrary aggression and a standalone invasion. Ultimately, this undermines the tacit knowledge about empire embedded in prophetic discourse. For as I argue, prophetic wisdom assumes a baseline understanding of empire, not merely as a one-time invading force, but as a web of human-designed operations that generate and sustain atmospheres of violence. Carroll proceeds to show how prophetic discourse makes extensive use of the Hebrew verb hurl, tul, to describe the exile of the Judeans, arguing that, quote, so the nation was hurled into foreign lands, hurled by the Tetragrammaton out of its own land and made to live among the nations, end quote. His sudden pivot from exile as a singular event of great violence to a theology of divine judgment collapses the conceptual space provided to imagine not an event, but a human-driven project that is systemic in scope. Instead, Carroll's theological reading normalizes exile as he makes clear in the following statement. Quote, diasporic existence among alien people became then for the Jews, the erstwhile people of Judah, their natural God-given environment, end quote. Like Ackroyd's acceptance theology, Carroll flattens the mechanisms of exile by privileging an all-encompassing theological discourse that reduces this imperial project to a God-given environment, and thereby natural. In many ways, the environment rendered natural in prophetic discourse are the human agents trained to produce imperial violence. It is precisely within this human-given environment that the prophets discern a theology of supernatural intervention. Across prophetic literature, this theological discourse indicts human abuses and seizes upon human-created systems, such as empire, that through repetition acquire a given form. In their theological critique, the prophets take for granted and thus render natural the collective human labor necessary to build and sustain an imperial system. They also confidently predict a conquering drive intrinsic to imperial agents, one that manifests in annihilating forms of violence. By extension, the prophets register the corollary human impact of this cyclical imperial violence, recognizing both the emotional and material suffering it inflicts on its human victims. These are the givens that lie beneath prophetic discourse, that through their repetition have achieved a state of inevitability. They are the unceasing humanness of empire, from its conquering drive to acts of bloodshed, and the ensuing humanness of its victims, from their felt terror to their deaths. In prophetic discourse, little explanation is required of this naturalized dynamic, human-driven conquest equating to human felt suffering, which again points to what the prophets assumed as given for themselves and their ancient readership. As Carroll's interpretation reveals, discerning this human-given environment has proven difficult for modern Western readers, especially citizen readers. I would even paraphrase that or make it even more specific, not just Western readers, but Western readers with citizenship. With privileges that protect them from the cyclical violence of imperial systems. To remedy this epistemic void, contemporary readers of the dominant group in Western societies would do well to linger on the anthropology of empire in prophetic literature, before rushing toward its theology. If we probe Carroll's biblical reference to hurling in Jeremiah 22, 26, and 28, a web of adjacent details emerge that identify human agents carrying out the imperial violence of exile. In verses 24 and 25, Jeremiah declares, quote, "As I live, says the Lord, even in King Jehoiakim of Judah, were the signet ring on my hand, even from there I would tear you off and give you into the hands of those who seek your life, into the hands of those whom you fear, even into the hands of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and into the hands of the Chaldeans." Here the prophet's anthropology and theology of empire converge, discerning a seamless collaboration between the divine and the imperial agents intent on executing the violence of exile. Staying with the text's anthropology, gender and number markers in verse 25 delineate a plurality of males predetermined to conquer and exile Judeans. The rhetorical strategy of repetition in the text draws our gaze to the male hand, yad. This single upper extremity serves as both a symbol of imperial power, and you can see that in the material culture left behind by the Neo-Babylonians and Neo-Assyrians, and the instrument through which that power is realized. In the Hebrew text, the singular form for hand, uveyad, is not intended to capture quantity, but rather a collectivity of purpose and a unity of force, as reflected in the NRSV's plural rendering, into the hands. Moreover, the male subjects linked to this collective hand admit to a given gender norm that pervades prophetic discourse. But put simply, men make empires with their bare hands. This is the human given ingredient of empire that the prophets take for granted: the male hand. Such specificity locates imperial violence firmly in the part of the male body that converts conquest into a tangible labor, felt both through and upon the human flesh. The touch of this violence commonly starts with the imperial agent gripping a sword, Jeremiah 19:7, Ezekiel 30, 20 to 26. With the weapon in his hand, the imperial agent of empire delivers a deadly blow to conquered bodies, Isaiah 10, 5-7, Jeremiah 21:7, Ezekiel 9:1, Ezekiel 23, 22 to 25. This conquering hand translates into a tactile violence in which diverse bodies are handled through their capture, slaying, raping, and splattering. Jeremiah 20, Jeremiah 34, Jeremiah 52, Ezekiel 21, Ezekiel 23, and Hosea 13. The widespread repetition of this collective male hand in prophetic discourse affirms the naturalized status of this embodied form of imperial violence. For the prophets, this is what male imperial agents do: a hand-on-body form of violence. So I have hand-on-body form of violence. This brings us to one of the most visceral details in prophetic discourse, the repeated focus on the hand. The prophets remind us that empire is not an abstraction, it is tactile, it is embodied. Before any phase of forced migration, the prophets register the anthropology of exile at its most visceral and gendered point of contact, the hands of male imperial agents. Such a focal point links exile not to a singular event, much like what we we've seen in the professional literature as how it's been interpreted, but to a repertoire of tactile violence. For the same hands that produce mass death in Jeremiah 19:7 also seize living bodies for exile in Jeremiah 24. In Ezekiel 21:31, these are the hands of brutalizing men, Beyad, Anashim, Bo'arim, that execute violence in a manner befitting the name craftsmen of destruction, Arasheh Mashchit. When we foreground these male hands, we see how the tactile violence of empire hinges on the preposition be. This simple word not only locates the point of physical contact for this violence into the hands, beyad, but also activates the tactile process of constraint, dispossession, and exile. This conceptualization of imperial violence brings us into the hands, where conquered bodies make direct contact with the human grip of empire. Drawing on Ezekiel 21:31, this human grip has the capacity to brutalize and destroy conquered bodies. And this pattern repeats across the prophetic texts. Jeremiah and Ezekiel return again and again to the image of bodies seized, bound, and brutalized. The repetition is itself a pedagogy. It teaches us what empire does. Jeremiah 21:7 also positions imperial violence in the hands of imperial agents. The prophet predicts a grim scene for post-siege survivors, those who survived the pestilence, sword, and famine. The imperial violence is a human-generated atmosphere that threatens the physical bodies of conquered people with sickness, sword blows, and starvation. Any attempts to escape this deadly phase prove short-lived, for their bodies remain, and that's the Hebrew sha'ar, they remain targets of imperial possession. Again, prophetic discourse locates their capture in the bodily grasp of male hands, and we talked about this at chapel, into the hands of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, into the hands of their enemies, into the hands of those who seek their nefesh, their lives. The imperial violence shifts from an atmosphere of death to a position on the male body that signifies capture and subjugation. Starting with the hands of the ruling male of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the repetition of this body part maps a cruel collective of imperial agents. The direct proximity of the post-siege survivors to their hands corporalizes imperial violence, what I call a hand-on-body form of violence. What drives their hands is a conquering mission that seeks total possession of post-siege survivors. As the Hebrew word nafsham in verse 7 suggests, their whole beings are the targets of imperial possession, extending dispossession to their very bodies. While siege violence inflicts environmental losses, lost landscapes, lost animals, lost loved ones, lost property, their physical capture initiates the dispossession of their own lives. The imperial drive to possess the whole being of post-siege survivors reveals a state of dispossession in which conquered bodies become seized objects of empire. In keeping with Vergara Figueroa's notion of deracination, the placement into the hands of imperial agents signifies at its most elemental level a bodily uprooting for post-siege survivors. This reading accounts for the material reality that gave currency to the prophetic predictions on imperial violence. Here, the symbolic meaning of hands extends the imagination beyond the real world, only to deepen our understanding of it. Such is the pedagogical aim of prophetic discourse on empire and exile, not to confine meaning to a symbolic world, but to transfer it to the real world where imperial violence leaves the stench of death. And this is in Amos 4:10 and Nahum 3:3. This is also true of the prophet's theology of imperial violence, though providing a counter-moral framework. The paired violences of invasion and capture into the hands of imperial agents. And there's loads of references with the hands of imperial agents appearing in Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Ultimately point to tangible acts that leave material ruin and fleshly wounds. Hence, symbolic and theological language works to create a nuanced awareness of the transformative power of imperial violence on the material world. At times, this language employs a surplus of imagery, and at other times it is made bare with totalizing terms like exile, golah, and captivity, shevi. In all, prophetic discourse discerns an imperial system by mapping its strategies of material violence from invasion to hands-on bodies to exile/captivity. Linked by a conquering drive, each phase of this violent project brings mass death and irreversible ruin. Collectively, they carry a deracination process enacted in, on, and around the bodies of conquered people, dispossessing them of agency and displacing them from their settled lives. For Vergara Figueroa, this process results in a lived condition. The condition of deracination points to the irreversibility and irreparability of this experience. Set in motion by the empire's siege violence, which ruptures territorial belonging, this process pulls captured bodies away from place, not only to possess them, but also as a requisite step toward their exile/captivity. In this way, exile is the displacement of captured bodies, a violence set up by invasion and set in motion at the point of contact with the conquering hands of male imperial agents. Here, exile/captivity is not simply the violence of coerced movement, where the source of suffering is solely tied to a change in geography. The exile-captivity nexus in prophetic discourse emerges as a deracinated condition of material, territorial, and relational loss, shackled bodies, and enduring psychic wound. The place of exile, captivity, begins with the conquered body in the hands of imperial agents, the place where they shall strip you of your clothes and take your beautiful objects and leave you naked and bare, Ezekiel 16:39. In those same hands, conquered bodies are seized and carried away to be slaughtered, Jeremiah 20:34 and 43. Before it marks a change in geography, exile captivity is tactile violence, torturing conquered bodies and binding their hands in fetters. Here, hands seizing and hands fettered become the initial site of dispossession, displacement, and deterritorialization. At the intersection of imperial possession and victim dispossession, prophetic discourse grounds empire not merely in a geographical place, but in an anthropological condition. Seizing, torturing, and binding bodies in mass requires a collective mindset that at its core reduces other people and their lands as objects of possession. The territorial expansion of empire through the possession of bodies is not an indiscriminate event of primitive savagery. That's what the ancient people did back then. But the result of collaborative forethought, strategic planning, material investment, and ruthless commitment to mass death. Indeed, the expression Jeremiah repeatedly uses reflects a pre-calculated mindset into the hands of those seeking their whole beings, their nephesh. This violent desire to conquer whole lives manifests not only in the hands of imperial agents, but also, as described in Zephaniah 2, in their faces. They all come for violence. With faces pressing forward, they gather captives like sand. Here, the anthropology of empire is made legible in and through human bodies, hands that kill, and faces that evoke terror, as in Jeremiah 29 and 39. Throughout prophetic discourse, killing, capturing, and exiling conquered people constitutes the human imprint of empire building. This ever-present human-derived system unfolds in the end on earth between humans. The mindset of imperial agents is marked by calculated cruelty and brutality, for as Jeremiah 21:7 declares, he shall strike them down with the edge of the sword. He shall not pity them or spare them or have compassion. From antiquity to the present, such brutalism has proven to be a requisite mindset for empire building, devouring lives and landscapes solely to affirm the supremacy of imperial agents. And this is a quote from Akili Mbembe, who identifies this imperializing mindset as definitive of colonization, where tactile violence transforms human beings into an inert mass of subjugated flesh. Quote, he or she is nothing but an appearance. He or she has a body. The colonizer can seize, harass, lock up the native, compel forced labor, make him or her pay taxes, or serve as cannon fodder. The settler can requisition the native for food cultivation and portering, can push or shove the native, lay him or her on back or side, administer a thrashing, wear out the native, hang him or her in public, kill him or her with rifle butt or bayonet, open the native's innards, or abandon his or her corpse along the road, exposed to the vultures and scavengers. Sounds very much like Amos or Nahum. Mbembe's description reminds us that exile is not merely a change of location, it is the systemic reduction of human beings to disposable flesh. To conquer humans, consume their life energy, and discard them as refuse are the tangible traces of a human-produced hierarchy of power that needs no conceptual category to define it. Following prophetic wisdom, this power is not abstract, but inscribed on landscapes and bodies. Wherever human beings are systematically disposed of, this form of power makes itself known. As Jeremiah 34:20 declares, their bodies say everything. They shall be handed over to their enemies and to those who seek their lives. Their corpses shall become food for the birds of the air and the wild animals of the earth. So with this background in mind, the anthropology of exile, we turn now to the poetry of Lamentations 1. Here, the poet inscribes these wounds into an acrostic, an ordered lament that refuses to let violence be forgotten. Exile is the third word in Lamentations, first acrostic poem. This position corresponds to the letter Gimel, thereby permitting the use of the word galeta, she has gone into exile. In this way, the poet's word choice is constrained by the alphabetical order of the acrostic. Each letter not only holds a distinct position, but also works in unison to complete the acrostic. The letter Gimel, therefore, requires the choice of a word that the acrostic ensures will be remembered. Here, meaning begins with a poetic strategy that gives the poet creative control over words, while also facilitating their recall. The word to remember is galeta. She has gone into exile, a feminine verb of violent movement. This mnemonic dynamic resonates with what Roberto Beneduce calls, quote, the stubborn will not to forget, not to allow the memory of violence and the accompanying infinite loss to be swept away. Above all, this is Exile in Lamentations 1, not merely an event, but a traumatic memory, or more precisely, a history of imperial violence. The acrostic also ties letters to one another, giving them a collaborative organizing function. This allows for words in the acrostic to work together as a collection of what I call word-object memories. The memory of exile, therefore, builds on the memories captured by the other word objects of the acrostic. As each word object memory in Lamentations 1 fulfills the order of the acrostic, they are set to intercommunicate, producing a multi-layered context of shared meaning. From letters to words to a collection of interlocking memories, the acrostic creates an interrelated world that can always be remembered. Before arriving to the third letter in this collection, the Aleph and Bet have already set the scene as tragic and distressing. In verse 1, the Aleph word object, aha, initiates the memory sequence of the first acrostic collection with an exclamatory cry. How? Lament that gives voice to a shocking memory of collective loss, the desolated city of Jerusalem. The loss is so severe that the poet likens the city to a lonely widow and a subjugated princess. To mourn this desolated city is to feel it in a woman's shame and alienation. Captured in the Bet word object is a memory that builds upon the first, where the city, Jerusalem, appears as a weeping woman. While a catastrophe involves a physical city, its severity is measured in tears. Immersed in profound pain, with just two adjoining memories, this collection moves in a way similar to how Sama Jabra frames Palestinian psychological suffering under occupation. Quote, an overlapping ripples of traumatic grief and, quote, expanding circles of injury. In tandem with this opening sequence of memories is the female embodiment of lament, her wailing giving rise to tears on her cheeks. Traumatic memory moving from letter to word to body aligns with what Beneduce calls, quote, the witnesses of evil in flesh and bones. And that's my translation. Instead of recounting the Neo-Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem as a single event, the poet unleashes its complexity through the intricate system of the acrostic. The interconnectivity of this system layer memories to create a continuum of unrelenting emotions of pain and sorrow. Relying on an alphabetical sequence builds repetition into the form, a dynamic that enacts the cyclical operations of imperial violence, where the pain is never a single event, but is a web of wounds marked on the body and lodged in the mind. So the acrostic is simulating that process. While the acrostic can bring order to this complexity, the poet also turns to female personification in a somatic affective register, shame, grief, alienation, to make palpable what Jabra calls the non-bleeding wounds that imperial violence inflicts on conquered bodies. Non-bleeding wounds, imperceptible wounds. By the time we reach the third letter, Gimel, the memory of exile is layered onto these earlier wounds. It is not just an event, but it's part of a widening circle of grief. The layers of traumatic memory thicken with the Gimel word object, Galeta, she had gone into exile. My first lecture takes its point of departure here. Exile as a multi-layered wound that bears witness to the flesh and bone operations of imperial violence. By reading with the grain of the first acrostic collection, we can discern the human mechanics of exile in the wounds that the poet expresses. Although theologized as part of divine judgment in verses 5 and 8, Lamentations 1 also acknowledges the human dimension of exile, from its execution to its psychosocial toll on the conquered. For alongside the poet's concern with why exile has come to Judah are details of the human agents who carried it out and the human wounds it inflicted. This human dimension of exile is rooted in what the poet's theology of divine punishment subversively attempts to displace: the empire. The exile of a population after the siege of their city was a common strategy of ancient empires. What the Neo-Babylonian Empire did to the Judeans after its conquering of Jerusalem, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had already done to the Israelites after conquering Samaria. Hence, my aim in this first lecture is to discern from the poet's lament over the wounds of exile, not a theology, but an anthropology of empire. What do these wounds teach us about a human-driven system of power that thrives on the excessive exercise of human cruelty? When seen as a manufactured weapon of empire, does exile help us grasp more fully the materiality of the wounds of imperial violence, its uniquely human pain? By recognizing what empire building requires, acts of annihilating violence, we can better anticipate their reemergence in the contemporary world. I think this is an untapped source of wisdom in the poetic literature and prophetic text, is how it is helping us to map a pathology of empire. Indeed, it is by seeing both the human behind empire and the human behind the wound that we come to a deeper empathy for those targeted for annihilation today. And I don't know if I'm good on time. I still have just a bit more here with this lecture on getting into now exile as a manufactured weapon. As the third word object in the first acrostic collection, exile registers first as a wound of memory, tied to the first two acrostic word objects. The exiled Judeans of verse 3 are the same people who once filled the city of Jerusalem in verse 1. Their absence translates into a wound of loss for the city personified as a woman. The interconnection between letters links the traumatic memory of exile in verse 3 to the city's widowed loneliness in verse 1. Subjugated to empire, the widowed princess city mourns incessantly over her loss and powerlessness. She's crying all night. By using the verb form for exile, galah, the third word object recalls their exile as forced migration away from Jerusalem. Their displacement amounts to a painful condition of suffering and hard servitude. The lament of the female personified city personalizes their exile not simply as moving away, but as leaving behind. The memory of their exile channels feelings of loss, the kind a newly widowed woman feels. Using the acrostic system, the poet shows exile to be more than an event. It is a multifaceted condition involving memories of loss, displacement, and physical suffering. While these wounds define exile for the poet, they do not fully exhaust its meaning. So far in this first acrostic collection, exile is mapped as wounding violence wrought by a human collective. In fact, the poet stays at the human level, both the wounded and their violators, until verse 5, when the God of Israel finally enters the scene. Where exile is lost for the city personified as a widow, the wound is deepened by apathetic lovers and treacherous friends. Verse 2. The same human collective, once a source of comfort, is now named her enemies. Her pain of loss renders exile a long-term crisis, exacerbated by uncaring and hostile humans. Moving further into verse 3, exile is also an unsafe environment for the Judeans that other people groups create. This environment marks a distant resettlement among the other peoples. And that's my translation of Goyim, trying to move away from sort of a nationalist thinking and keeping it in sort of a people field of meaning for Goyim, so peoples, where she finds no resting place. So among other peoples, she finds no resting place. First, we encounter exile as memory, then as movement, now as milieu, a place marked by an atmosphere of unrest for the Judeans. Here, it is a collective of human agents who make exile a wounding place. Combined with their uprooting from Jerusalem, a wound likened to a grieving widow, their exile bears all the marks of a human-derived system of wounding that maximizes their suffering. The architects of such wounding come into fuller view in the final line of verse 3. Her pursuers have all overtaken her in the midst of her distress. Unlike the lover friends turned enemies or the unrestful placemaking of other people, these human agents have a set mission to pursue and overtake the Judeans. The verbal pair of pursue, which is radaf, and overtake, nasag, appear frequently in the Hebrew Bible to mark scenes where the human intent is harm, even death. At the core of this verbal pair's field of meaning lies human-to-human violence. Placed within the context of Jerusalem's conquest, the language of pursuit and overtaking the Judeans signals the imperial agents of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. What makes this an accurate profile is the way the pursuers overtake, that is, to do violence to the Judeans, precisely while they are already in distress. Referred to as female Judah captures the collective nature of their distress. The plurality of this single female figure or subject corresponds to an adverse external environment, one conducive to producing distress. Moreover, gender intensifies this collective distress, deepening its affective meaning. In such an external environment where male pursuers, so the pursuers are male, overtake a feminized Judah, imperial violence is stripped to its essence, male domination. And given that exile is the designated word object for the Gimel letter, this affective nuance inflects its memory as one of pursuit, capture, and the subjugation of a feminized collective. Reading Exile through these layered wounds draws its pain unrelentingly close. This embodied pain points to the tactile violence of empire inscribed on conquered bodies. Exile, in this sense, is a scarring wound inflicted by the gripping hands of imperial agents. Through its interconnectedness with other traumatic memories, the acrostic collection amplifies the felt pain of exile, extending it across multiple sites of imperial violence. In this way, exile remains in the background of rape, destruction, and death, yet surfaces explicitly as a permanent state of captivity. Lamentations 1:5, her children have gone away, captives before the foe. Lamentations 1:18, my young women and young men have gone into captivity. Beyond a disaster experienced as external, distant, and singular, exile is an imperial habit that touches the whole person, fracturing kinship ties and unsettling the very wounds of the very grounds of belonging. Within Lamentations, these wounds are archived in the acrostic form, cataloging not only embodied pain, but also the imperial project that produces it. Exile, in this context of alphabetic repetition, mirrors exile as a recurring strategy of empire. In the end, this is what all empires do. They displace the people they have conquered. So to end, exile in the language of the poet and the prophets is not only about geography, it is about the undoing of life itself. And that is where I want to leave us tonight. As we have seen, exile in Lamentations 1 is not simply a matter of geography. It is the wound of a people seized, bound, and carried away. It is the touch of male imperial hands gripping and fettering bodies. It is the distress of a widowed city grieving her children. It is the memory of violence that refuses to be forgotten. This is the acrostic. The poet's acrostic insists that these wounds remain present, letter by letter, word by word. Exile is thus both a strategy of empire and a stubborn archive of trauma. And if prophetic discourse can teach us anything, it is that empire is not inevitable, but built by human minds, human systems, and human hands. Recognizing this helps us see more clearly the worlds around us. It draws us into empathy with those still pursued, those who are overtaken, those who are displaced today. And it urges us to refuse the theological and cultural moves that normalize imperial violence as natural or God-given. So my hope is that as we remember the exile of Judah through Lamentations 1, we also become more alert to the mechanisms of empire that continue to wound flesh and uproot lives in our own time. To see both the human behind empire and the human behind the wound is, I believe, a step toward resisting the cycles of annihilation and opening ourselves to a deeper solidarity with the exiled and the dispossessed. Thank you.